Well, hello, it's Andrew here, and this is my opportunity to share a little about my experience recently in Taiwan. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to travel under the CIF International Programme to undertake an international professional exchange in Taiwan from October into November 2024. If you look down below, you'll see some information about CIF International, perhaps CIF Taiwan, but I thought it would be interesting to start with two questions that were posed to me on the very first day of our programme. The first was, is Taiwan the most dangerous place on earth? And that kind of took the wind from me a wee bit. I thought, what a question. Now the speaker, who was the president of CIF Taiwan, she went on to say, well, we have earthquakes and sometimes we have serious earthquakes. Indeed, just in May of this year, there was a very serious earthquake in Hualien, which was one of the cities we were scheduled to visit. She said we have typhoons every year for a whole season, and they can be devastating. Whole communities can be disrupted, people can die because of typhoons. And finally, she said, of course, we also have a neighbour, a big neighbour, who casts a big shadow on the country. So she went on to explain that the neighbour influences politics, education, economics, really most areas of life. But actually most Taiwanese ignore their neighbour on a day-to-day basis. It's not a big factor in their lives, despite what we might see on the news. The second question she asked, is Taiwan actually simply the biggest Chinatown in the world? And her rationale there was actually most people no longer speak Taiwanese, they speak Chinese, Mandarin, and actually fewer and fewer people have an understanding of Taiwanese history, Taiwanese culture, the things that are most meaningful for Taiwanese. So that was an interesting two questions to start. Across the trip, we also ascertained that most of the people that live in Taiwan are of Chinese Han heritage, and the indigenous community would consider themselves of Austronesian descent. So actually more closely related to the Maori of New Zealand than to people from mainland China. So it was very interesting to hear about the people of this island, this beautiful, beautiful island. CIF Taiwan has been established for a few years, just as there's a CIF Scotland, and I was joined in the programme by colleagues through the same CIF programme from Germany, Austria, Estonia, Sweden and Australia. But when CIF Taiwan was being established, the big neighbour said you have no right to establish CIF Taiwan. So CIF Taiwan is almost flying under the radar a wee bit, and certainly my thanks go out to Ah Kwan, the president, and her very warm welcome that she extended to myself and to my 5 colleagues from Europe and Australia who had the opportunity to visit for 2 weeks. We followed a hefty programme in Taiwan. I thought it would be interesting to share some things I noticed. Not quite culture shock, but certainly cultural differences. Now for context, I live in the middle of the countryside. I think there's about a dozen houses where I live. And I landed in Taipei, which has a population of millions. It is a huge, busy, overcrowded city. The buildings are massive. So the former tallest building in the world, Taipei 101, is in Taipei City in Taiwan. It's massive, absolutely massive. So that was different for me. I think what struck me most on my first days in Taiwan, in Taipei City, was how clean everything was. There was no litter anywhere. There was a huge number of shops that extended onto the pavement, including restaurants or cafes or market stalls, but there was no rubbish, nothing lying about, no crisp bags, no pieces of chewing gum, no mess whatsoever. Everything was spotless clean. It was incredible. The subway had a white floor and it was spotless clean. Now, there were big signs saying no eating or drinking on the subway, and that was adhered to. And that's maybe an indication of this. The second thing that struck me was how rule-oriented Taiwanese people are, how conscious of being a good citizen, of being a good neighbour, it felt everyone was. So there was one morning I went down to catch the metro, and it was so busy. It was rush hour in the morning. There was hundreds of people queuing to get on to the next train that came. Queuing. I have never seen that at the bus stop in Scotland or at the train or even in Glasgow's underground. People queuing very politely, very respectfully, and very quietly. It was so quiet despite the millions of people being there. Absolutely incredible. And everything was spotless clean. It was just absolutely incredible. And I think that personal responsibility to society really just shone through so often that people did their bit for their community. Now, I think the most obvious example was towards the end of my stay, there was a huge typhoon. It was fairly devastating. The next day after the typhoon, there was devastation everywhere. Lots of trees were down, the trees had fallen on people's bicycles or motorbikes or cars, and there were branches everywhere. It was a lot of damage was done. Now, throughout the course of that day, I followed my programme, but I was outside quite a lot, and I was amazed at the number of council workers with chainsaws and trucks taking away these big trees that had all been felled. It was incredible. The council workers are so busy, so diligent, so hardworking. The following morning, as I was then leaving my accommodation around 6 o'clock in the morning, there were groups of community volunteers out sweeping up the leaves and the broken twigs and branches, the smaller items that the council hadn't taken away. And so by that night, you would never have known that a typhoon had swept through. It was absolutely incredible, that community spirit, that care, that consideration for themselves and for the community that they lived in and for other people. It was really quite incredible. I think I also noticed a real focus on hygiene. Everywhere I went, people had tissues available or hand gel for your hands. Quite a number of people wore face masks, but it wasn't mandatory anywhere. But again, it was a respect for others. But another curious thing was there was no dustbins. Never saw a dustbin the whole time I was there. So I asked, where are the dustbins? And the response was, well, people just use them. And that caused me to say, well, is that not a good thing? No. People have a personal responsibility. They should take their rubbish home, and it's their responsibility to dispose of their rubbish. It's not for someone else to come and empty that bin. So there are no bins anywhere in public places. But interestingly, when the bin truck does come to the residential areas, I mistook it for an ice cream van. I could hear the singing, like an ice cream van, the tinkle tinkle. And that was the rubbish coming to be collected. Now the rubbish trucks will come to a street, and it's for each household to then take the rubbish from their house and take it to the rubbish truck. So there is no rubbish kept in bins outside. Everything is kept in someone's home until the bin truck comes. And yeah, the bin trucks sing. So does the underground. The underground train, as it's approaching, each station has a different song that is played to indicate that the underground train is approaching. And again, the first few times I was just thinking, who's playing that music? And that was the sound of the train approaching to tell everyone. And we had the opportunity to go to visit an indigenous community, and that was in the mountain. So I was very far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We travelled down these massive motorways, and it was so smooth, no potholes, beautiful, very busy roads. There was one point where there was roadworks, and there must have been 20, 30 road workers, all very busy at the side of the road. And I just noticed that. To me, it felt different. Oftentimes in Scotland, if you see roadworks, it's not immediately apparent what's happening or who's working or what they're working on. But this was fairly incredible, a huge squad of workers all working away. But we got to the mountain, and this was a complete change of pace, change of atmosphere, the opportunity to go to a community basketball match involving a few different schools. And so for a couple of my colleagues on the trip, this was a real highlight for them, and they were interested in youth work and engagement with young adults. Very interesting to see the interactions between younger people and their teachers or the older adults that were watching. And we continued on, and we went to a community association, Mavroon, set in the mountain. And it was so green. Everything was green. And I noticed very quickly a lot of the fruits on the trees and persimmons were growing. So not a terribly common fruit in Scotland, but the persimmons, very ripe, approaching the harvest time at that time in Taiwan. And each fruit was individually wrapped on the tree to protect it from birds or insects that might eat it. And I couldn't help but think, wow, that's a job for whoever trees those are. Now there were tens of thousands of trees. There were field after field after field. And all the persimmons were individually wrapped. You could see bunches of grapes individually wrapped to protect them, to protect the harvest. And I was just gobsmacked at the labour that must have gone in to protect the fruits. I found out about the school day. So I had the opportunity to stay with two host families, one in Taipei and one in Taichung, two different families, and both told me a little about the school day. For both families, the school day started about 7:30 in the morning. So of course you have to get to school in advance of that. The school would start at 7:30 and it would finish about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But both families, and indeed other adults that I spoke to who had secondary school age children, talked about after school, there's after school lessons. There's after school tutoring, there's extra classes to help you prepare for your examinations. So one of the boys that was in one of my host families, it would be normal for him to go home 7 or 8 in the evening, and then he would have to start his homework. And it just felt incredible, absolutely incredible, the level of diligence that was going into that school day, the level of effort. Just how exhausted these young people were when I saw them in the evenings was, again, quite overwhelming, quite different to the experience I think a lot of Scottish secondary school students would have of what a normal day looks like. Weekends as well were often filled with learning, extra tuition, practice for exams. It was full on. I spoke to one of my hosts who wasn't feeling so great, and I asked her what were her options. And she explained that they could use Western medicine if they wanted some quick relief, but they could also use Chinese medicine for a more lasting cure. And I found that very fascinating. And actually that resonated with some of my experiences in the past from sub-Saharan Africa, where people would use the Western medicine sometimes, but local traditional medicines at other times. Whatever would work. Health insurance covers both, so there's no financial barrier to accessing whichever form of medicine you prefer. And indeed, most people would use both, and they would have their choice of whether to have a quick fix or a longer term solution. Indeed, it was also quite common for people to seek to have their fortune told, to find out what the future would hold. And I saw several fortune tellers, always busy, always with a queue of people. And of course, religion is a big factor in Taiwan. And I had the great fortune, the great opportunity to visit 2 or 3 different temples, including the Longshan Temple, one of the largest temples in Taipei, and to have just a really, at times quite overwhelming experience of devotion, gratitude, and people seeking support through their faith. Buddhism and Taoism are the 2 most popular religions in Taiwan, and many temples indeed catered for both Buddhists and Taoists and people of other faiths. So very interesting that they were a place of congregation, but not necessarily just for one flavour of faith. They're very peaceful places, very beautiful and ornate places, often with many, many, many gods present that you could communicate with. And indeed very specific parts of the temple that you could go to, depending on what you were seeking advice or guidance or support with. So one part of the temple, if you're seeking guidance about your employment or your career or your job. A different part if you're looking for guidance about relationships or your family. Another part if you want to speak about your health. And there'd be different groups of people at different parts of the temple, depending on what they were seeking guidance with. Very fascinating. A few other things I noticed. So space in Taipei is very valuable. Most things are small. Most things are crammed into a small space. So doors, most doors slide open. So doors to shops slide open to the side along the wall, rather than opening in or out. And I thought that was incredible. And there was a wee button on the front, press the button and the door slides open. I noticed that large vehicles, buses, trucks and whatnot, would beep every time they indicated. So in Scotland, you're very familiar with larger vehicles beeping when they reverse, but beeping when they go around a corner to indicate that is, wow, there's a lot of beeping. I also noticed, Again, people are so diligent, they only cross at a zebra crossing, they only cross when there's a green figure showing. If it's red, you do not cross. And there's a countdown to show you when the red is changing to a green or vice versa. I also noticed that the emergency vehicles flashing, sirens, stop at red lights. And I was really quite taken aback. They obey the traffic signals. None of the other drivers seemed to be getting out of their way. So the flash, I saw this with police cars and with ambulances, and it was really quite astounding, difficult for a foreigner to comprehend. I noticed CCTV everywhere. This was a big difference for me. Everywhere we went, there was CCTV in offices, in shops, on the street, everywhere. It was absolutely a surveillance society. Now, I've not been to big cities in Britain for a long time. Maybe it's similar in Britain as well. But certainly for me, it was noticeable. I had the great pleasure of going to a lot of different organisations, to the central government, to local government, charities and other foundations. And so often, whoever the chair of the meeting was had a materially larger chair than anyone else. And that was just curious to notice. I think it was especially noteworthy in the government type departments. It was interesting. But there was a degree of formality in most of these meetings. So quite often I had a name badge. Frequently there'd be a gift waiting for me, placed in the table. There'd be a great emphasis put on who was who and who had which job. At the end of, I think, almost every session that I was part of, there'd be a photograph. So everyone would pile into the photograph. And the CIF Taiwan representative would always be presenting whoever had hosted us with a certificate to say thank you. It was very noticeable. But it was also very noticeable that most of the photographs did not involve standing and saying cheese. They involved making some kind of symbolic gesture to the camera. So this was a common one. And that's a small heart. You're putting your fingers in the position as the base of a heart shape, indicating the number 6 or the number 7, or common gestures in a photograph. And finally, putting your hand into a heart shape and putting it by your cheek. It's a K-pop gesture, so Korean culture coming into Taiwanese culture, and absolutely standard. So many photographs I have of small groups of people, usually with a certificate being presented, and everybody in the photograph making some form of gesture. Again, it's just different, and perhaps something I'll bring into Scottish culture the next time I'm asked to have my photograph taken. The time of year I visited Taiwan was hot. One of the first mornings, it was 33 degrees at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was pushing 100% humidity. It was hot. I did find it uncomfortable at times, quite difficult at times, because it was so hot. Most of my Taiwanese friends found this quite humorous, that I was so hot, because most of them did not appreciate the temperature. As our fortnight went on, the temperature did drop slightly, maybe to the high 20s, I think to 25 degrees on one day, and quite a few Taiwanese people were starting to feel cooler, noticeably cool. They were putting on a wee jumper or jacket. I was still finding it really hot. It was very grey in Taipei, very overcast. Quite often there'd be drizzle. Now, for someone from Scotland, it was hardly worthy of the name, like a smurr, a drizzle, really trivial amount of rain. But for the Taiwanese people, it was umbrellas up time. People did not want to get wet, not for the slightest moment. And again, I find this curious. So I would be walking with my host and I would say, it's not raining, just drizzle in the air, it's not raining. But everyone else would have their umbrellas up. So there was a good piece of humour between us about whether it was Taiwanese rain or Scottish rain, whether it was even raining or not. But certainly Taiwanese people do not like getting wet. The last thing I noticed, and it was in a conversation with my host in Taichung, was about military conscription. And this was something that I've never really come across, that I've never experienced. I don't ever remember talking to anyone about before. I've perhaps heard about it on the news, usually in countries that are experiencing conflict. But the dad spoke about military conflict for his sons that would be imminent. And that again was quite a shock for me to hear and be exposed to, that reality. And it almost brought us back to that opening question posed by the president of CIF Taiwan. Is this the most dangerous country in the world?